My name is Marwan Soli, and I'm the chairman, and Ellie is the timekeeper. The adjudicator is Mr. Patrick. The topic of tonight's debate is the ISIS bride should not be allowed back to Australia. The affirmative team is seated to my right from Pembroke, and the negative team is seated to my left from Pembroke. The speaking time for tonight's debate is 6 minutes, and a warning bell will be sound 1 minute before the speaking time, and a double bell will be sound at the speaking time. A continuous bell may be rung 30 seconds after the speaking time, which in case the speaker must sit down immediately. Please ensure that your mobile phones and any other electronic devices are switched off. I declare this debate open and call upon the first affirmative speaker, Thomas Town.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Chairman, the topic for tonight's debate is that the ISIS bride should not be allowed to return to Australia. We as the affirmative team strongly believe this statement to be true. We define ISIS as an extremist Islamic militant group and the term ISIS brides as women who have left their home country to join ISIS and married an ISIS insurgent. We define should not as both a moral and legal obligation to not do something, and the phrase be allowed to return to Australia as Australia accepting the ISIS bride's desire to come back to Australia to live in and rejoin Australian society. Today's first speaker, I'll begin by explaining how by refusing ISIS brides return to Australia, we will show them that their actions have consequences and make an example of it, showing that terrorism will not be tolerated. I will also explain the ethics behind refusing their return. Our third speaker will inform you about the national security risk they pose to our country, and also how allowing their return violates our country's anti-terrorism laws and policies. Our third speaker will rebut and sum up our team's case. In 2014, the spokesperson for ISIS, Mohammed al-Adnani, announced the formation of Islamic State, and as written by the American anti-terrorist organization West Point, they extended an invitation to anyone willing to pledge their allegiance to the Islamic State. In a period of time after the invitation, numerous Australian citizens left Australia for countries such as Syria and Iraq to join ISIS. To join ISIS, whether as a male militant or a female bride, one would have to pledge allegiance to the Islamic State. ISIS on multiple occasions has called for its militants to attack the infidels in their homes, their markets and their roads, and to wage an all-out war against the West. By pledging allegiance to ISIS, ISIS brides are essentially denouncing their country, Australia, and declaring war on it. The term ISIS brides is also misleading. The Combating Terrorism Centre at West Point states that women are often active participants in Islamic State operations, rather than just vulnerable young girls lured with the promise of romance. As reported by The Independent, female ISIS members are known to dress their husbands before their acts of rape and even clean them off afterwards. They are not unknowing of the acts that ISIS members commit and are directly linked to both planning, supporting, and conducting them. Just as any crime has its consequences, conducting or being an accomplice to criminal acts has its consequences, and by allowing the ISIS brides to return to Australia, we are showing them that it is acceptable to commit these atrocities, essentially denounce Australia for the Islamic Caliphate, and then simply demand return. Refusing ISIS brides to Australia sets a firm but necessary precedent, further dissuading anyone from joining any extremist terror groups. This leads into my second point, how the ethics behind their return is morally wrong. In a paper written by the British Columbia University, they discussed the ethics and thought process behind legal systems and their sentences. They concluded that Western countries' justice systems are very much based on a set of consequentialist ethics. Consequentialist ethics judge whether an action is right or wrong by analysing, as the name suggests, the consequences of the crime, not by whether the action itself is correct or not. Under consequentialist ethics, not allowing ISIS brides into Australia would be the appropriate response, as it does not place any of Australia's 24 million other citizens at risk. Australia's government and laws are all designed to protect these citizens, and by allowing ISIS members to return, it does the opposite. Disclaiming returning ISIS members posing a risk towards civilians is not without evidence. In a study published by R. Kim Cragen, analysing a dataset of 27 ISIS-linked terror attacks in Western Europe, 19 of the 27 attacks had links to returned foreign ISIS fighters. Whether in mentorship of the perpetrators, directly supplying or funding them, or even carrying out the attacks themselves, returning ISIS members still pose a significant risk to society upon their return. My final point is regarding the resources that would have to be allocated to support their return. Even if Australia allows them to return, they would have to be monitored constantly. As I previously detailed in my last point, Returning ISIS members hold an undeniably higher threat level, and just as people with past criminal backgrounds are monitored by the government, returning ISIS brides would be no exception. Surveillance in Australia is not only an expensive operation, but also a time and manpower intensive one. The other option, incarcerating the returning ISIS brides, is not a viable option either. Imprisoning the returning ISIS brides would defeat the purpose of their return, as they want to rejoin Australian society, not spend the rest of their lives in prison. Aside from this, Australia has the fourth most expensive prison system in the world. According to ABC.net, imprisoning a single person for a year costs on average $111,000. That's more than our combined debating team's school fees. The Australian government can much more effectively redistribute these funds to other government facets, or even assist those who are displaced due to the violence the ISIS brides support. Aiding the camps themselves would benefit thousands of people displaced by the conflict ISIS began in Syria and Iraq. They left Australia to fight for ISIS, which started the wars in Iraq and Syria, that as of 2019 has displaced over 6.2 million civilians, and now they expect to be let back into the country. The millions of people displaced by the violence ISIS perpetrates, who have to flee the conflict, risking their lives because of ISIS, have to stay in refugee camps, whilst the ISIS brides simply get to return to a wealthy country that is then obliged to support them and look after them. This hardly seems fair. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman, the ISIS bride should not be allowed to return to Australia. It would be unjust for the millions of people displaced by the war ISIS started, who have to remain in the humanitarian aid camps. Not only this, but it is also consequentially wrong, placing the greater Australian public in danger. Finally, it shows the ISIS brides that their actions have consequences, and not being allowed back into Australia after they essentially denounced and declared war on it is one of these consequences. It may be harsh, but it sets a necessarily firm precedent. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, it would be both consequentially immoral and illogical to allow their return. Thank you.
I call upon the first negative speaker, Sophia Sunim.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that ISIS brides should not be allowed to return to Australia, and we, as a negative team, strongly believe this statement to be false. We would like to amend the definition given by the Affirmative team, and we'd like to add that ISIS brides are additionally Australian citizens. This is correct, as this is about returning to Australia, and in the context of the topic, these brides are Australian, so the definition should state it. Before I move on to my points, I'd like to rebut some of the first affirmative points. Now, the other team has tried to tell you that by refusing them, it shows that actions have consequences. However, this is wrong because we're not saying that if they were to come back, they'd be able to roam freely. We're saying that they'd be able to face a trial and face a punishment for their actions that they did in Syria, and this would not defeat the purpose and further make Australia look bad. As the first speaker, I'll be speaking to you about how Islamic brides should be given the opportunity to have a fair trial to be tried in Australia for their intentions and actions in the Islamic State, as well as the bride's rights as an Australian citizen. Our second speaker will be speaking to you about how the benefits of de-radicalization and how they can be monitored by the security forces, as well as how the treatment of ISIS brides contributes to Islamophobia. Our third speaker will sum up and rebut our case. Now to my points. My first point is how Islamic brides should be given the opportunity to face justice for their intentions and actions in the Islamic State. Australia has a legal obligation to investigate people associated with the Islamic State to see if they've been involved with any kinds of crimes themselves, as many of the jihadi brides joined ISIS for love and may not have been necessarily committed to ISIS's agenda of violence. Secondly, to interrogate these people for their intelligence reasons to determine what they know about other Islamic State fighters and their intentions and other information about war crimes could be beneficial to the Australian society. Now, according to Australian Human Rights Commission, in the determination of any criminal charge against him or of his rights and obligations in a suit at law, Everyone should be entitled to a fair and public hearing by a competent, independent and impartial tribunal established by law. By failing to repatriate and put ISIS remnants through the legal system, not only will it simply encourage other nations to disregard their responsibility to citizens stuck in Syria, as well as making the long-term situation more dangerous, as the Islamic State brides will try to hide out and turn to militant groups for support and protection, and may become further radicalised by others or radicalise others, including their own currently underage children, which our second speaker will further elaborate on. So ISIS brides should be allowed to return to Australia to face justice, a fair trial, in regard to their time in Islamic State. My second point is that as the ISIS brides are in fact Australian citizens, that they do have the right to return to Australia legally and be tried. According to the Department of Home Affairs, as an Australian citizen, any citizen is entitled to leave and re-enter Australia as many times as they want. This means that even though what they have done is certainly against the law, they are allowed to re-enter Australia. In my first point, I spoke about how Australian citizens are entitled to a public hearing if there is any determination of any criminal charge against them. Now, according to the Australian law, in section 119.2 of the Criminal Code Act of 1995, it is an offence for a person to intentionally enter or remain in a declared area in a foreign country where the person knows or should know that the area is a declared area. The maximum penalty for this offence is 10 years of imprisonment. The war zones where ISIS forces have been operating and the ISIS brides have been going to are declared areas. The government has, according to the Parliament of Australia, put almost $1 billion towards programs combating radicalisation and de-radicalisation of Australians who have been taken advantage of. These programs aim to, according to the Department of Home Affairs, help people move away from violent ideologies and reconnect with their communities. This means that the ISIS brides do actually have the right to return home and face the consequences for their actions, in addition to being de-radicalised and having any threat that they may bring taken away. Furthermore, it may be argued that these brides are in fact products of Australia. They are citizens, they were brought up in Australia, they attended Australian schools where they would have learnt about Australian citizenship, its rights and responsibilities. So if something did go wrong, and that they did not know how to learn how to act responsibly in society and uphold the values of a democratic, free society, then the Australian society holds some responsibility also, and therefore it needs to allow them back here to address their shortcomings through further education and de-radicalisation programs, which our second speaker, Tom, will address in his speech. So in conclusion, ISIS brides should be allowed to return to Australia because Australian citizens are entitled to face justice with a trial, as well as it is in their citizen rights to return to Australia. Thank you.
I call upon the second affirmative speaker, Dylan Wordsworth.
Good evening, ladies, gentlemen, timekeeper and chairman. The topic for tonight's debate is that the ISIS brides should not be allowed to return to Australia, and we, the affirmative team, believe this statement to be true. Our first speaker has already highlighted how this will demonstrate that the ISIS bride's heinous actions have consequences, and how it is ethically sound to ensure these people are prevented from re-entry into Australia. Today, as second speaker, I'll speak to you about how the entry of these ISIS brides will jeopardise national security, and how permitting terrorists to enter Australia will undermine a policy of non-negotiations with terrorists. We accept the amendment to the definition proposed by the opposition, however, we will be attempting to prove this case to be false. The first speaker has attempted to tell you that these people should be tried in the Australian justice system, and that's why they should be returned. This is false, as in accordance with our definition, which was not amended, pertaining to this clause, it states that they will come back to Australia to rejoin society, which entails not being imprisoned, which is outlined by our first speaker. Furthermore, there are significant economic costs of $112,000 annually, which was also outlined by our first speaker. It is also important to note that some of these people are actually eligible for trial in the International Criminal Court and the international law system, as I'll elaborate upon later. They've also said that these people are Australian citizens and as such deserve to be returned. This is also false, as anyone who rejects their citizenship by denouncing it and going to a country, to an organisation which is at war with Australia, makes them treasonous, and we do not have the requisite to look after them. Now to my first point, that ISIS brides pose a threat to national security. On February the 18th, 2019, a statement from the Office of the Prime Minister was released pertaining to national security. It detailed the extent to which our national security had been undermined and provided commentary on our national security policy. It noted that the Australian government will continue to take a proactive and coordinated approach to protecting our national security. This policy protects the interests of Australians by preventing terrorist acts and minimising the risk to Australians. By this national approach, it would be senseless to return 9 people who remain a risk to public safety at the possible expense of any one of our 24 million citizens, as our first speaker has already touched upon. Each one of these people have committed terrorist acts, as well as one committing war crimes in accordance with the Geneva Convention. The International Committee of the Red Cross says a war crime constitutes as one of the most serious and breaches of international law, and are held before the same organ of the United Nations that tried Nazis at the end of World War II. War criminals are prosecuted under international law, developed solely to protect us from people deemed to be so dangerous they pose a risk to the whole world, and are thus prosecuted in the International Criminal Court. This demonstrates that these people are more than the wives of soldiers. They are dangerous people who have not only committed crimes against humanity, but mastered the art of leading people into terror better than anyone else. It is not safe to return terrorists who, according to the Australian newspaper, were involved in beheadings and preaching of kill unbelievers in alleyways, stab them and poison them. The same person was also reported to say, poison your teachers, go haram restaurants, and poison their food in large quantities. It is self-evident that these people continue to undermine the safety and security of millions through their sociopathic acts and expression of radical ideologies. The proclamation of such ideas on social media highlights how ingrained their desire is to destroy Western society and cause mass panic. Whilst male soldiers may be considered a greater threat to security, women should not be discounted as lesser. Whilst most males are fighting for a cause in a foreign land, these brides are the ones calling upon thousands to commit terror on home soil, killing innocent people and jeopardising the modern way of life as we know it. As Jeanette Rankins, America's first female politician, said, the greatest threat to peace is the barrage of propaganda portraying war as decent and honourable. Furthermore, one of the ISIS brides, Juman, stated in a television interview, "Oh, do I miss my family? Well, I think you'll miss yours soon," directed at a reporter. This demonstrates how ISIS brides are violent and threaten to kill on a regular basis. Their radical ideologies exist as a great threat exacerbated by their time in war-torn Syria. It is unreasonable to assume that such wholesale attacks on the lives and welfare of Australians can be reversed through insincere repentance and repatriation to a nation they have called on for attack several times. These women are more than those who fight in a conflict, the soldiers of a war. These are the people behind the sinister leadership and execution of mass brainwashing propaganda. As such, bringing back war criminals and propagandists to Australia will be at the detriment to citizens our government has an obligation to protect and undermine the safety of each of our 24 million citizens. Now to my second point, about how we will not negotiate with terrorists. Part 5.3 of the Criminal Code Act 1995 stipulates that a terrorist act is a threat made with the intention of advancing a political, religious or ideological cause with the intention of coercion or influencing by intimidation, and is one of only 7 Australian crimes that extend beyond borders. As such, it is unreasonable for the Australian government to negotiate with people who are, by definition, terrorists and war criminals. Doing so would create both a public perception of subordination and a perspective by the terrorists of vulnerability and weakness in policy. A publication from Reuters noted that negotiations give legitimacy to terrorists and their methods, and undermine actors who will pursue political change through peaceful means. The unopposed passage to Australia for war criminals and terrorists would not only set a dangerous, irrevocable precedent, but undermine the instigation of consequences for those who defect to a lethal terrorist organisation. Granting the safe passage for these criminals would only serve to promote the legitimisation and incentivisation of joining terrorist organisations. It is unreasonable and unsafe to accept the insincere repentance of these brides. Thank you.
I call upon the second negative speaker, Tom Sage.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for our debate is that ISIS brides should not be allowed to return to Australia, and we, the negative team, believe this statement is false. The second affirmative speaker has tried to tell you that by allowing ISIS brides to return, it damages our non-negotiation with terrorist policy. This is wrong because each ISIS bride's case is unique and should be treated as such. Not all of them are terrorists. This is why they should be given a trial, which this blanket ban on their return disallows. He also said that the return of ISIS brides will jeopardise Australian safety, and I will go into this later in my speech. Our first speaker has already explained how the ISIS brides should have the right to a trial in Australia, and today I'll be talking to you about 3 points. My first point is how the ISIS brides and their children should benefit from the de-radicalisation processes and resources offered by Australia. The de-radicalisation process offered in Australia is comprehensive and much better than the treatment that ISIS brides and their children would receive where they are. Australia has actually recently, according to the Australian Parliament, put almost $1 billion into projects involving de-radicalisation for people like this. And if they're allowed to come back to Australia, even to be detained, they will benefit from these programs. Syria, where they are located, is in no position to offer such resources, and if they stayed there, they and their children would no doubt be exposed to terrible experiences, and this could lead to even more radicalisation. In contrast, the funded de-radicalisation has worked before, a notable example being Tanya Joya, who is now a de-radicalisation activist. By allowing the ISIS brides and their children to have access to these resources, which they have a certain right to as Australian citizens, they can live better lives, and the country, as well as the world, would be safer. My second point is that by allowing the brides to return to Australia, security can be assured, which would improve both their safety and the country's. By allowing ISIS brides to return to Australia, they could be looked after and have a higher level of safety could be assured for the public, whether that involves detention for their crimes or monitoring and the de-radicalisation process I mentioned before. One of the main objections the media and other people keep circulating about the return of the ISIS brides is security and threats. But do they really think this threat would be better monitored while overseas? The ISIS brides would have access and supervision from agencies like Australian National Security, which would help all parties involved. Now to my third point, which will highlight how this debate is tied up in Australia's perception and media portrayal of Islam in general, as well as how the treatment of ISIS brides furthers Western stereotypes and Islamophobia. First, we should establish that Islamophobia is very real in Australia, and the problem is also connected to terrorism. Think about the Christchurch attacks last March, which were allegedly perpetrated by an Australian, or the Cronulla race riots back in 2005, which saw large groups of people attempting to assault anyone who looked remotely Middle Eastern. These are extreme examples, but other Islamophobic instances occur every day and predominantly target Muslim women. These instances are often tied up with references to terrorism, and this is even used to justify hatred against Islam. This is then increased by a media megaphone and groups such as News Corp, Sydney's Daily Telegraph, and of course Alan Jones, who interviewed people and ran stories to promote Islamophobic ideas, again using the justification of terrorism. There is still the widespread belief that the ISIS brides, who are a good example of all this, were all used for propaganda, and that they're all militants, and that they're all security threats. And while ISIS brides were involved with an extremist organisation, each individual's circumstances should be treated uniquely. By putting a blanket ban on the former ISIS brides from returning, as the topic suggests, this would destroy their rights to a trial, as our first speaker spoke about, and also a complete generalisation about them. The media is already in a frenzy about this, and the entire case promotes the stereotypes of all Muslim women, whether you believe they're dangerous terrorists or victims of circumstance. Furthermore, this would actually help ISIS. As Waleed Ali said in his famous speech about the group, ISIL's strategy is to split the world into two camps and try to divide the world with fighting between religion amongst normal people. This is another reason which the ISIS brides and their children should be allowed back into Australia. It's also in our country's integrity's best interest to prevent us from all becoming an Islamophobic people. So, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, the ISIS brides returning to Australia will be beneficial for both them and our country, and without appropriate action, Islamophobia will be supported. Thank you.
I'll call upon the third affirmative speaker, Jasper Dew.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that ISIS brides should not be allowed to return to Australia, and we, as the affirmative team, undoubtedly agree with this statement. I would first like to point out some flaws in the opposition's arguments and then summarise my team's case. The first affirmative speaker has tried to convince you that the ISIS brides should be allowed to return to Australia to face a fair trial for their actions. This is incorrect because we are not saying that we will simply allow them to return to Australia to roam free. This is unreasonable as they are coming from a terrorist organisation. And according to our definition, which they did not amend to this particular clause, be allowed to return to Australia, meaning Australia is accepting the ISIS bride's desire to come back and rejoin Australian society, not to allow them back to detain and confine them. That is not allowing them to return to Australia, that's capturing them and charging them for their crimes, which is a different matter altogether and not the topic of this debate. These brides would have no desire to come back to Australia if they were to face a lifetime or 25 or so years of imprisonment and unsuccessful rehabilitation, which I will go into later. She also tried to reason that they have rights to return to Australia as they are Australian citizens. This is invalid because while they are Australian citizens, they do not have rights to just return to Australia on terms of the terrorist charges that they will receive for being part and supporting of ISIS. According to the Australian Federal Police, it is an offence to direct the activities of, be a member of, recruit for, train for, or receive training from organisations such as ISIS. These offences attract penalties of imprisonment up to 25 years. Additionally, there is a returning terrorism suspects team, which uses investigation techniques and strategies, together with disruption and diversion capabilities, to prevent, disrupt, and prosecute terrorists, such as these brides, wanting to return to Australia. She has also tried to tell you that if they are allowed to return to Australia, they will be put through rehabilitation and de-radicalisation. And their second speaker further stated that Australia has spent lots of money on these de-radicalisation programs. First of all, money doesn't mean success. The rehabilitation of radical extremists in Australia is currently ineffective and unclear in its success rate. As stated this year by International Journal of Policing, Intelligence and Counter-Terrorism editor Dr. Julian Drugan. He believes that the adequate structures to rehabilitate some people in Australia are not currently in place. And it believes that rehabilitation is largely ineffective of these extremists, as their views are so deeply ingrained in their heads from denouncing Australia to join a radical extremist group. The second affirmative speaker has tried to persuade you that there is better monitoring over here in Australia. This is wrong because not only is this an incredible economic endeavour to constantly survey these brides, but also monitoring is ineffective in ensuring the prevention of terror. Allowing these brides back over here will allow them to further influence other vulnerable young extremists, which I will get into later They've also attempted to show that the ISIS brides were young and impressionable, lured by love and the promise of adventure, and made decisions that they may now regret. This is and this is why they should be forgiven and returned to Australia. This is false because in Australia we hold minors criminally capable for their actions, and therefore being in their youth does not exempt the brides from punishment and committing a crime against Australia. He has also tried to convey that the media portrayal of ISIS increases Islamophobia. This is invalid because by returning these known terrorists to Australia, it would only increase Islamophobia and only damage the public perception of non-extremist Muslim women by putting them in the same boat as these returning terrorists from Islam. Now, additionally, The Guardian stated that The Guardian stated that in prisons, our first speaker has already outlined the roles of these extremist brides who consciously join ISIS, and that they must face the consequences of denouncing Australia to illegally join a radical terrorist group. These extremist brides are not victims. They are aware of the terrorist group's horrific actions, often contributing to and supporting ISIS equally, and occasionally more than their husbands. He also explained the Australian justice system's basis on consequentialist ethics, determining an action's validity by judging the consequences of that action, and using this to highlight how our consequentialist legal system should not allow the ISIS brides to return in order to protect Australia's 24 million citizens. Finally, he mentioned the astronomical prices of detaining these undeserving extremist brides, and how resources could be more effectively directed to aid overseas refugee programs. Our second speaker explained that allowing these ISIS brides to return poses an extensive threat to the national security of this company. He also highlighted the significant and threatening role that these brides play in the maintenance of ISIS, and that we must not negotiate with terrorists. In conclusion, we unquestionably believe that ISIS brides should not be allowed to return to Australia. Thank you.
I call upon the third negative speaker, Emil Smith.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that ISIS brides should not be allowed to return to Australia. We, the negative team, firmly believe that this is false. Before I sum up my team case, I will first address some flaws in the opposition team's case. The first speaker on the negative team said that incarcerating the brides is too expensive and we shouldn't do it. However, despite the fact it will cause cost to the Australian government, we're still obligated to give them a trial. According to the Australian Human Rights Commission, in the determination of any criminal charge against him or of his rights and obligations in a suit at law, everyone shall be entitled to a fair and public hearing by a competent, independent and impartial tribunal established by law. These people have in fact committed criminal acts, as section 119.2 of the Criminal Code Act 1995 states. It is an offence for a person to intentionally enter or remain in a declared area in a foreign country where the person knows, or should know, that the area is a declared area. The maximum penalty for this offence is 10 years imprisonment, and the war zones where the ISIS forces have been operating, and the ISIS brides have been going in declared areas. This means that while it might not be easy for the courts to give ISIS brides a fair trial, and certainly won't be cheap, we are still obligated to give them the trial, land the criminal charges, and rehabilitate them. The first speaker of the affirmative team also stated that ISIS brides would pose great risk to Australia and the Australian people. With the steps the Australian government take, the risk to the homeland security is low. The government has, according to the Parliament of Australia, put almost $1 billion towards programs combating radicalisation and de-radicalisation of Australians who have been taken advantage of. A success case of this was talked about by our second speaker, Tom, and these programs aim to, according to the Department of Home Affairs, help people move away from violent ideologies and reconnect with their communities. In addition, the Australian government recognised that entering these war zones is indeed a criminal act, under the Australian law, which I've already spoken about. In addition, they will take into account the crimes that may have been committed overseas in their punishment. With a fair trial, they can be imprisoned for their crimes, and the de-radicalisation processes we put so much of our resources towards can be utilised to destroy any threat which they may have against the country. Why would we leave them to become further radicalised and pose a greater threat to Australia, as well as their children, who will also become radicalised over there, when we can take the people in and also take away the threat? The second and third speaker on the negative team said that since the definition stated they would return to society, this means that they are immune from the legal system. However, this is simply not true. Prison is in fact an integral part of Australian society. This is how we punish and reform the people who we determine that have committed crimes we believe are against what we believe in, as dictated by the Parliament. The prison system is very much a part of Australian society, and saying anything otherwise is untrue. The second speaker also said that this would be saying to other potential terrorists they would be protected by Australia. However, in this case, it's not about protecting the terrorists. It's about protecting Australian society from radical terrorists. As our second speaker, Tom, explained, Australia's de-radicalisation processes are comprehensive, and staying in Syria will lead to further radicalisation, posing greater threat to Australia. In addition, we will be imprisoning them as to monitor, de-radicalise the brides and make sure they aren't back on the streets until we determine they are not a threat and it is safe to do so. Gina Vale, co-author of the ICSR report tracing the women and children of ISIS, has also said that it would be safer for Western societies if the women were all repatriated. Otherwise, she says, they could be extradited to third countries or used in detainee exchanges within the region. If so, they could pose a long-term security threat to Australia. Why should we leave them there for their hatred to brew when we could put it out and secure the country further? The third speaker of the Affirmative team said that since it's an offence to join ISIS, and since they have a team to prosecute these brides for the crimes committed overseas, they shouldn't return. However, this further reaffirms that they will be imprisoned for their crimes and receive the punishment which they should receive under Australian law. He also said that since an article stated the Australian rehabilitation efforts are ineffective, no one should return, they shouldn't be returning for rehabilitation. However, our second speaker has already spoken about a success case of our rehabilitation system and the power it holds. If the efforts are so poor, how come they have succeeded? Now I will sum up my team's case. Our first speaker, Sophia, spoke to you about how the ISIS brides should be given the opportunity to face justice for the crimes which they have committed, and how they have the right in Australia to face the courts. She also spoke about how they have the legal right to return to Australia, which is what will allow them to be tried, a right Australian citizens are given, and de-radicalised. Our second speaker, Tom, spoke about how the ISIS brides and their children should receive the de-radicalisation processes the Australian government pays dearly for, and how this will make Australia safer and take away the threat from these brides. He also talked about how this is tied up in Australia's perception and media portrayal of Islam in general, as well as how this treatment of ISIS brides furthers Western stereotypes and Islamophobia. He also spoke about how the de-radicalisation process is comprehensive. So, in conclusion, these ISIS brides are legally required to have a trial in Australia for the crimes they have committed, and how this whole idea is wrapped up in Western stereotypes. Instead of abandoning these people and fueling further hate towards Australia, we can take them in, de-radicalise them to remove the threat, and then, after serving their time for their crimes, re-assimilate them into Australian society as hard-working and valuable members of our country. Why should we increase the threat towards our country when we can instead reduce it? Thank you.